Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
A lot of them said they showed up to move into their apartments and, their apartments weren't ready, and they had, U-Hauls full of their stuff outside. All this was going on, and they were moving people in and kind of promising dates, that they didn't hit to these tenants. At the same time, a rival developer was building a apartment complex across the street.
It's fair to say this story was not a puff piece. You took kind of a very serious look at what they're up to. Have you gotten any pushback since this story was published?
I haven't. We haven't really heard from the developers.
I'm Sarah Fenske. St. Louis-based Lux Living has invested more than $150 million in the city in the past few years. The developer specializes in multifamily rentals, and its projects include nearly 1,000 units in DeBoliver Place, Lafayette Square, and Soulard. But with all that construction has come many disgruntled tenants, and some observers now questioning why the city continues to give the company tax subsidies for its work. Lux Living's work was the recent subject of a story by the Post-Dispatch's business, politics, and economic development reporter. That is Jacob Barker, and he joins us today. Jacob, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Sarah.
So, Jacob, people might know this company as Lux Living, or they used to be STL Citywide, and even before that, they were Asprient. Who are these guys?
Well, they got started as Asprient. They owned a lot of smaller properties around the city. And then they started doing development as Asprient around 2016 or so, and kept getting bigger and bigger. They first kind of got on the radar. I think you were at the Riverfront Times when that first story came out with a lot of tenant concerns about properties being kept up and some of their business practices. But, that kind of passed, and they stopped using that Asprient name a few years later. And they were always very quiet. They never really talked to the media much with some of their projects. We kind of knew who they were, but you'd have to go and look at the business records. And that's when we kind of realized maybe 4 or 5 years ago, this is STL Citywide is Asprient. It's Vic Alston and Sid Chakravarty, who are brothers. And anyway, they've kind of become more public in the last few years because they've become one of the biggest developers in St. Louis in terms of multifamily housing.
Yeah, they're not just they kind of started out, I think, buying like these smaller brick buildings, maybe 8 families in them, 10 families in them. They're doing some really big projects right now.
Yeah, really big projects, especially in the DeBoliver Place neighborhood. They have 3 actually on Pershing up there right north of Forest Park. They've got, if you drive, on 44 from downtown like I do to get home, you'll see a crane in Soulard. That's one of their projects it's on 7th Street, I believe. Used to be a truck dealership that they're building a pretty big apartment and a parking garage on right now.
And so you did kind of a deep dive into how all this is working out for them and for their tenants. What are some of the biggest complaints that you're hearing these days about their work?
In terms of the story, what we kind of wanted to do, I feel like we didn't break too much new news. It was kind of, this has kind of come out in dribs and drabs, and we kind of wanted to put everything into one story so people could kind of know who these guys were and what their past is and what they're all doing, and kind of get it all into one place in a comprehensive take. But, while we were kind of talking about it and what's the hook, some of these tenants in the Hudson reached out to me and said, it's a luxury apartment. These guys are paying, $2,000 a month in rent, pretty high rents. And they were just very frustrated. Construction was still going on. They've recently told me that it's seems like it's getting close to being done. But they're paying $2,000 a month. They were promised all these amenities. It's taken a while to get these amenities. I think they've got a spa in there, and the gym, and a sky bar or a bar on the top floor, stuff like that. And they were just kind of frustrated that it had taken a long time and all this construction noise, and they kind of felt, a lot of them said they showed up to move into their apartments, and, their apartments weren't ready, and they had, U-Hauls full of their stuff outside. And they were just, they felt like management wasn't being straight with them on how long it would take. So that was kind of a hook. It's kind of similar to some of the complaints from that story when they were, these guys were known as Asprient, that the Riverfront Times ran. And it was just kind of a look at, maybe these tenants had some questions about their management practices.
Yeah, we should give actually Kay Petrin is the reporter who did that for the Riverfront Times back in the day. It still serves as a great sort of guide to all the problems tenants were having with them. Kay, of course, went on to work here at St. Louis Public Radio, so I got to give them that shout out. But they blamed, in your story, you were able to talk to them or at least get a statement from them, and they blamed supply chain issues for some of these complaints. Does that track? Does that seem like a plausible explanation in light of the record of evidence you're looking at?
I mean, there are a lot of supply chain issues. There's a lot of labor issues. That it could be an explanation for construction issues taking this long. But, all this was going on, and they were moving people in and kind of promising dates, that they didn't hit to these tenants. At the same time, a rival developer was building a apartment complex across the street. And that's kind of what spurred my interest in Lux, because across the street there's another developer. It was known as Pearl, and now it's part of CRG, but Jeff Tegethoff. He had gone through, gotten all these city approvals. He bought land for Metro. It was going to be a transit-oriented development right next to the Metrolink station there. And this neighborhood association that Lux's principals and their lawyer brought back from the dead, essentially, it had been, nobody had done anything with it for a decade or more, sued them. And at first, it was a lawsuit and going back and forth, but then construction stopped on that Pearl development, or it's known as Expo at the Forest Park. And reportedly that was because, some of the lenders got spooked over whether, this clouded the title, and construction halted for a few months. So basically one developer was hurting another developer in St. Louis, and St. Louis can use all the development and investment it can get.
Yeah, and so this had big repercussions for that project. That project is now again underway. And it was interesting to hear the people you talked to. They're like, "Man, I just wish I had moved across the street instead."
That's what one of Corey, who we talked to. Yeah, you could see it, going up across the street, but. But, it was interesting that they were moving all these people in as fast as they could before they were completely done with the unit, which isn't completely unprecedented. But, they're going to have a rival open across the street. Mm-hmm. And, they claim that it has nothing to do with, why that organization sued. That rival development. They say they were concerned about parking, but again, that development was supposed to be a transit-oriented development, and it's got a lot of parking. They asked for a little less than normal, arguing that we worked with Metro on this to buy their land. We're right next to a Metrolink station. We don't need as much parking as other developments in St. Louis.
So that's one of the bigger issues with these guys, beyond just people who are paying them rent and feel like they're not getting what they want. Another issue that you kind of delve into has to do with tax incentives. And we know that those are very common for big projects in St. Louis. But how has getting these tax incentives helped fuel the growth of this company?
Well, a lot of their early projects got tax incentives as big investments, big multifamily projects do in St. Louis. It was pretty run of the mill, but city officials kind of got a little wary when one of their projects, I believe it was in Soulard, and then also one in De Bolivar Place, they sold a couple of years after building it. I believe, it was the one in De Bolivar Place that they sold a couple of years after finishing, and they made a big profit. The buyer from San Francisco, reported the sales price. It was more than they said, it would cost to build, which is how the city calculated how much tax abatement to give them. And so the city has since instituted a policy, this was 2020, where they will try to claw back some of their tax incentives on, not just Lux, but other projects if the developer sells for a windfall, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, you had some interesting stats in this story. Lux sold it to a San Francisco property group for nearly 50% more than the $30 million it told the city the development would cost. A big profit there. Some officials, you report, worried the tax break was used in this case to secure a larger sales price from the buyer. So the city's not happy about that. At the same time, there has been some argument. NextSTL.com, there was a great essay that appeared in this where the essayist was saying, why are we giving such big tax breaks to somebody who has this kind of track record? There's a lot of unhappy tenants. This goes back years and under different identities of this company. Should we be looking at the value that somebody brings as part of whether or not they get these tax breaks? Is that something that city officials are talking about or questioning at this point?
Well, since some of those early projects, to be clear, the city has not given them any more tax abatement. The Hudson, for instance, under the old regime of the city development office, Otis Williams, when they found out that they were trying to use this neighborhood association to block the expo, they basically said, look, we're not going to sign off, give final approval to your tax abatement, which they did give initial approval to. The Board of Aldermen did pass. And I will note one alderman tried to say, hey, why are we giving them tax abatement when they're hurting another development in the city? And it was Heather Navarro, who's no longer on the board, and she was basically, shouted down, scolded because she broke the rule of aldermanic courtesy. You never say anything about somebody else, a project in somebody else's ward. But anyway, despite all that, the City Development Agency has not approved tax abatement for the Hudson, the project that I talked to a lot of the tenants for. Lux actually sued the city over that and said, hey, you got to give us tax abatement. This is a ministerial act. You got to just sign. The Board of Aldermen passed it, and you got to sign off.
The city does not have discretion in who it gives tax breaks to. We're going to sue because everybody deserves these, was sort of their
kind of,
argument?
and that, the Board of Aldermen has already passed it, but, the office that gives the tax abatement, it's created by state statute, and they have some discretion, was the city's argument. And Lux eventually dropped that. So they do not have tax abatement on the Hudson, a project. Well, all tax abatements, developers say, hey, we can't build this without tax abatement. This wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, they're still building it.
They're still building it. So going forward, do you think they're going to get the cold shoulder from City Hall on future tax abatement? What's your sense of the mood over there as it relates to this development company?
Well, they haven't since asked for any other tax abatement, so we haven't quite seen how the city will react. I did sit down with the new kind of regime of the City Development Office late last year to talk about the city's new approach to tax incentives. And Noelle Pfeffer, who's the mayor's kind of in her cabinet and
Director
does development
of Policy
stuff.
and Development.
Policy and Development,
Yeah.
Thank you. I asked him about it, and he was like, we've got this new framework, and basically said, I don't know how well Vic and Sid are going to do under this new framework. So it hasn't been tested yet, but they kind of have indicated, they'll take a critical eye.
So they did give you some comments on your story. Your story, it's fair to say this story was not a puff piece. You took kind of a very serious look at what they're up to. Have you gotten any pushback since this story was published?
We haven't really heard from the developers, but we tried to be fair. To be fair, they have invested a lot of money in St. Louis.
Sure.
They have brought, I was actually just talking to somebody the other night who lives in the neighborhood in DeBoliver Place, and, he said he's an older gentleman, and he said, a lot of young people live here now. It's so that's not necessarily a bad thing. Mm-hmm. A lot of neighbors aren't thrilled with the company, but they acknowledge, hey, they've brought in a lot of younger people, highly paid professionals. You got to be if you're affording rents like that. So to be fair, they've invested a lot of money. Mm-hmm. St. Louis can use all the investment it can get.
And we did hear from some listeners who had some thoughts on this company. People sent us a couple emails. We've also heard from somebody on our Facebook page. There are definitely some complaints about this company, but it remains to be seen if they can solve these problems with their tenants and what's going to happen at City Hall. Jacob Barker, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks again for having me.
Today's episode was produced by Emily Woodbury with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.